Welcome to this video on Speaking and Listening Standard 3. We will discuss how to evaluate a speaker's point of view. We will be covering the core standards in speaking and listening. Evaluate a speaker's point of view, reasoning, and use of evidence and rhetoric, identifying any fallacious reasoning or exaggerated or distorted evidence. We will be covering the following: evaluating a speech, creating a checklist to evaluate a speech, identifying different forms of reasoning, applying reasoning in evaluating a speech. You've probably been listening to people speak since you were born, and most likely have a good idea on how to figure out what people are saying and what they mean when they speak. We need to take time to evaluate a person's speech. We evaluate a speech in a way that offers benefit to the speaker and to yourself. This is a checklist to follow when evaluating another person's speech. We first focus on what was said by the speaker in the speech by answering these questions. What type of speech was given? Did the speaker show flow in the speech? Did the speaker support his or her main ideas? Then we take note of how the speaker conveys his or her message. We ask, did the speaker show confidence? Did the speaker confirm his or her words with gestures? Did the speaker project his or her voice clearly? Did the speaker vary the pitch of his or her voice? Did the speaker vary the rate of his or her speaking? Did the speaker pronounce all the words clearly and correctly? There are forms of reasoning that you can apply to evaluate a speech. You can use fact and opinion and valid reasoning. In order to determine whether a speech is reliable, you must analyze speech to decide whether it is reliable and distinguish between fact and opinion. You can also use valid reasoning to think logically and draw valid conclusions. There are three forms of valid reasoning: inference, generalizations, analogy. Let's take a look at inference. Inference is a reasonable interpretation of the information given. How can we distinguish valid or invalid reasoning? We must take into consideration the main ideas by these questions. What details do you observe as clues to the main idea? What main ideas do you conclude from these details? Also, we should look into conclusions with this. Does your conclusion follow logically from the inference you've made? Is there any other interpretation of the details that might lead to a different conclusion? We can also apply generalizations. A generalization is a conclusion based on a number of particular facts or cases. How do we distinguish a valid generalization from a hasty generalization? You may find these questions helpful. What facts are presented as evidence to support a general statement? Are there any exceptions to the generalization or any qualifying factors you need to take into account? Are enough cases or examples presented to make a valid generalization? An analogy is a comparison between two things that are similar in some ways but are essentially unlike. There are two kinds of analogies, complete and incomplete. To distinguish between the two, answer these questions. How are two things being compared essentially alike? How are the two things alike? Is the comparison logical? What statement does the comparison make about one of the objects? When you take the time to evaluate another person's speech carefully, you can accomplish two things. First, you can give the speaker constructive criticism that will be useful in improving his or her speaking skills. Second, you can apply the speaker's effective speaking skills to your own speeches. This will help you in different ways. You can apply this knowledge and skills in your own speeches and research. It will improve your critical thinking skills. Let's do an activity. Using what you learned in this lesson, make a detailed evaluation of a speech given in class. Then list two more skills that the speaker used effectively and consider using them in a speech that you will give in the future. Let's do another activity. Write a paragraph discussing the skills you are developing in giving public speeches. Mention those parts of the process you find particularly easy, as well as those you find difficult. Then note the one thing you plan to work on most in the future. Why do we need to evaluate one's speech? We need to evaluate one's speech for it will benefit both you and the speaker. It will also help you in the future when you give a speech. Are we going to benefit from it? You will be able to learn from the techniques of a speaker and how to effectively deliver a speech. Is it necessary to follow the checklist? You may or may not use it, but always take it into consideration, being able to properly evaluate a speech. Without a checklist, you may not be able to understand different aspects of delivery of the speech. What constructive criticisms can we give the speaker? Constructive criticisms are not to find fault on a person, but to help them improve on different aspects that they are dealing with. It can help the speaker improve on delivering his or her speech. As a student, you're expected to make evaluations of a speaker's point of view, reasoning, and use of evidence and rhetoric. Identify any fallacious reasoning or exaggerated or distorted evidence. We've come to the end of our session. We've discussed evaluating a speech in a way that offers benefits to the speaker, focusing on what was said and how it was said, applying forms of reasoning to validate evidence presented in a speech. By the end of this session, you should know or be able to do the following. Evaluate a speech. Create a checklist to evaluate a speech. Identify different forms of reasoning. Apply reasoning in evaluating a speech. This information should help your speaking and listening skills. Good luck with your speech.